I want to tell you what it feels like to be chosen by someone whose heart is still in someone else's hands. It doesn't feel like being chosen at all. It feels like being a substitute. A stand-in. A band-aid pressed over a wound that's too deep for band-aids. It feels like setting the table every single night and sitting down to eat alone, even when he's sitting right across from you. My name is Seraphine Valdres. Sarah, to almost everyone. And for almost a year of my life, I was the mate of an alpha who looked through me like I was made of glass. He didn't mean to. That's the part that made it harder, not easier. Because if he had been cruel, I could have left. If he had been cold on purpose, I could have built walls of my own and called it even. But Caden Ashvale wasn't cruel. He was grieving. And grief, I have learned, can take up all the space in a room without even trying. I was the woman the moon goddess sent him after his first mate died. I was his second chance. And for the longest time, I wasn't sure he wanted one. This is my side of the story. The one no one thought to ask for. Part 1, the life I built without anyone's permission. Before the bond changed everything. Before I tell you about him, I need to tell you about me. Because I think that's the part people always skip in these stories. The woman shows up, the bond happens, and suddenly her entire existence becomes about the man who isn't ready for her. Her feelings become a reaction to his. Her growth becomes a response to his walls. I refuse to tell it that way. I was a person before Caden Ashvale. A full, complicated, sometimes messy person. And understanding that is the only way any of what came after makes any sense. I grew up in the Valdres Pack, a mid-sized pack in the Northeastern Territories, led by my father who served as Gamma. We were not wealthy by pack standards, but we were stable. Happy, mostly. I had 2 older brothers, a mother who made the best soup I've ever eaten in my life, and a childhood that felt, from the inside, like solid ground. When I was 14, the Valdres Pact dissolved. That's the technical word for it. Dissolved. Like it was just a thing that happened, like sugar and water, clean, painless, complete. It wasn't. What actually happened was a power dispute that fractured the leadership, split loyalties down the middle, and sent families scattering to whichever neighboring packs would take them. My parents went to the Greywood Pack. My brothers followed. I was supposed to go too. I didn't. I don't fully know how to explain the decision, even now. I was 14 and furious, and something in me refused, to simply be absorbed into someone else's structure. To become a Greywood wolf when I had been a Valdres wolf, and those were not the same thing, and pretending they were felt like swallowing a lie. So instead, I did something that scandalized my mother and quietly impressed my father, though he'd never say it. I went to live with my human aunt in the city. I spent the next 17 years building a life that belonged entirely to me. College. A career in healthcare administration, organizing the systems that kept hospitals running, which suited something in my brain that liked order and hated chaos. An apartment I chose every piece of furniture for. Friends who didn't know what I was, which had its complications, but also its freedom. I visited my parents. I maintained the bonds that mattered. But I kept myself at a comfortable distance from pack life because pack life, to me, meant belonging to something, and the last thing I'd belonged to had disappeared. I was 31 when I went to the Autumn Council. I went because my father asked me to represent the Valdres family in the absence of my brothers, who both had new pups and couldn't make the trip. It was a political event, the kind I'd always found faintly exhausting, all the posturing and hierarchy signaling, but I loved my father, so I put on a dress I wasn't entirely comfortable in and I went. I was not expecting anything to happen to me there. I was definitively not looking for a bond. And then a man across the room looked up from a conversation, and every single one of my carefully constructed walls shook at the exact same moment. Part 2, the bond that arrived without an invitation. What it felt like to feel something I didn't ask for. Here's what no one tells you about second chance bonds. They are not soft. People talk about mate bonds like there's something warm and gradual, a slow bloom, a gentle recognition. Maybe first chance bonds are. I wouldn't know. But the second chance bond arrived in my chest like a thunderclap. Like something that had been missing for 31 years suddenly slammed back into place so hard it knocked the breath out of me. I was mid-sentence. Talking to a woman from the Crestfall delegation about supply chain logistics, genuinely interesting conversation, I want to be clear, and then my hands started shaking. Not slightly trembling. Shaking. Like the ground under me had become unstable. I excused myself, quietly, and went to find a wall to put my back against because everything in my body was suddenly pointing in a direction I hadn't chosen. The direction turned out to be him. I didn't know who he was yet. I knew he was an alpha. You can feel that even through a crowd, the particular gravity that alpha wolves carry, and I knew he was somewhere behind me and that my every instinct was screaming to turn around. I didn't turn around. Because I had 17 years of independent life telling me, be careful. Be sure. Don't let a biological imperative make your decisions for you. So I stood against that wall and I breathed, and I thought, and I waited to see what he would do. What he did was nothing. I found that out from a woman named Britta, who introduced herself about an hour later with the direct, warm energy of someone who has assessed a situation and decided to involve themselves. She told me the alpha's name was Caden Ashvale. She told me he was the head of the Ironveil pack. She told me he'd lost his mate several years ago. She said it the way you say something important that you want someone to sit with. I sat with it. That was the first thing I understood. His distance wasn't personal. His distance was pre-existing. He was a man still living in the aftermath of something terrible, and the moon goddess had placed me in his path anyway, and neither of us had asked for that. When we finally met properly the next morning, he walked over to the table where I was eating breakfast alone, sat down across from me without being invited, and looked at me with these gray eyes that were simultaneously intense and somewhere else. I made a decision. I was not going to chase him. I was not going to perform for him. I was not going to make myself smaller or more palatable or easier to love. I had spent too many years building a self I was proud of to dismantle it for someone who wasn't sure he wanted to be in the same room as me. But I was also not going to run. Because the bond was real. I felt it the way you feel your own heartbeat, undeniable, constant, not something you can argue yourself out of. And underneath the grief in his eyes, there was something that looked like it recognized me. So I shook his hand when he extended it. I told him my name. And I braced myself for whatever came next, because I already knew, in the quiet, certain way that some things make themselves known, that this was not going to be simple. I was right. Part 3, Ironveil. Learning to breathe inside someone else's grief. He brought me to Ironveil in November. I want to tell you what that felt like, because I think it's important, and I think no one talks about this part. Walking into a home that belonged to a dead woman. Not in a dramatic, haunted house way. Not with her photographs on every wall or her name spoken in hushed tones. It was subtler than that. More insidious, in a way. It was the way certain rooms were arranged with a care that felt like preservation. The way the left side of the master bedroom was clearly claimed and the right side had the quality of a space that hadn't been touched in a long time. The way people in the pack would sometimes look at me with this flicker of something, not unkindness, but adjustment. Like they were recalibrating. She had been here. She had been loved here. And the man who had loved her was now, technically, mine. I was given the guest suite. The nicest one, east wing, beautiful windows, silver birches outside. He told me I didn't need to take a pack roll right away. He told the pack to give me space. He was perfectly, exhaustingly kind. And I was almost completely invisible to him. I understood it, intellectually. Grief isn't rational and it isn't fair and it doesn't move on a schedule. I understood that he hadn't asked for this any more than I had. I understood that love doesn't transfer, that whatever he'd had with her wasn't something that simply rechanneled itself toward me when she died. Understanding something and being okay with it are not the same thing. What I felt, in those first weeks, was loneliness of a specific and particular flavor. The kind that's worse than ordinary loneliness because you're not alone, you're surrounded by people, you're living in a full house, you're in proximity to a man who is technically your mate. And yet, I started filling my days deliberately, because the alternative was sitting in the beautiful guest room counting the ways I was not quite real in this place. Britta pulled me into pack administration. She had a gift for identifying what people needed before they knew they needed it, and what I needed was purpose. Roan, the beta, showed me around the territory without making a big deal of it, which I appreciated because he seemed like a man who made a big deal of very little. The packmates were kind. They were curious about me in the way you're curious about something new that's arrived in a familiar space. Not hostile. Just calibrating. I calibrated too. I told myself, give it time. He is grieving. People grieve at their own pace. You are strong enough to wait. What I did not account for was how long waiting would feel when you were already lonely going in. Because here's the thing about me that Caden didn't know for months, that he didn't ask about for months. I already knew what it felt like to have the ground disappear beneath you. I already knew what it felt like to lose a place you belonged to. The Valdres pack wasn't a person, but it was a home, and losing it at 14 had left a specific kind of permanent caution in me. I didn't detach easily. I didn't claim spaces easily. I moved through Ironveil those first months like a guest, because I had learned a long time ago that treating something as yours made losing it worse. So there I was, careful with myself, careful with him, trying to find a foothold in a place that already had its geography arranged around someone else's shape. At dinner I would watch him look through me. It wasn't aggressive. It was almost worse than that. It was the gaze of someone whose attention is somewhere that doesn't include the present room. He would look up from his plate, his eyes would land somewhere near me, and I would see his focus skate past and settle somewhere I couldn't see. I would look down. I would eat my food. I would think, this is not a life. The 4th month, I asked him directly, do you want me here? Not the real question. Not yet. I wasn't ready for the real question, and honestly neither was he. He said yes. I knew he meant it. I also knew his yes had a door in it that was still closed. I said thank you and went back to my room, and I sat on the edge of my bed and I had what I can only describe as a very quiet conversation with the moon goddess where I asked her, with genuine curiosity, what exactly she had been thinking. No answer. There never is. What I did instead was go to the garden at midnight, the way I sometimes did when the walls of the house felt like they were pressing in. There was an oak tree there, old and broad, clearly planted as a sapling at some point, grown into something significant. I didn't know whose it was yet. I just knew it felt like a place where the air was easier to breathe. I was sitting under it when he found me. He sat down. He didn't ask why I was out there. He didn't offer anything performative. We sat in silence for a long time, and I felt the bond humming between us the way it always did, insistent, patient, like water that has decided it will find a way through eventually. And then I said it. The thing I'd been carrying for 4 months. She must have been extraordinary. I didn't plan it. It just arrived, the way true things sometimes do when you're tired of holding them. He said, she was. And something in the simplicity of that, the way he didn't apologize for it, didn't soften it, made me trust him a fraction more than I had before. I'm not trying to replace her, I told him. I don't want to erase her. I looked at the tree. I just wish you'd let me be someone new. Instead of not letting me be anyone at all. I got up and went inside. I went to my room. And for the first time since arriving in Ironveil, I cried. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly, with my face in my pillow, the way you cry when you're used to doing it alone. Part 4, the night I almost left. What I almost chose instead. I want to be honest with you about something. I am not, by nature, a martyr. I know some stories like this one cast the woman in the role of the patient saint, endlessly understanding, endlessly forgiving, her goodness measured by how much she absorbs before she finally cracks. She waits and eventually her waiting is rewarded, and isn't that beautiful? That's not who I am. I was patient with Caden because I understood what he was going through, and because the bond was real, and because underneath the grief I could see flickers of who he actually was, and that person was worth the effort. But patience has a bottom to it. At least mine does. 6 months after coming to Ironveil, I started seriously thinking about leaving. Not because I didn't feel the bond. I felt it constantly, a warm pull in my sternum, pointing at him like I was a compass and he was north. The bond didn't waver. That wasn't the issue. The issue was that a bond is not a relationship. A bond is a beginning. It is an invitation. But you still have to open the door and walk through it, and he was standing in the doorway, and I was standing in the hallway, and we had been in that hallway for 6 months, and I was starting to feel the specific exhaustion of waiting for someone to decide you were worth the risk. I had packed a bag. Not dramatically. Not as a statement. Just practically, the way I do things, I had a bag by the closet door with some essentials in it, because I think in contingencies, because I learned at 14 that having an exit plan isn't pessimism, it's survival. His sister arrived the weekend I had decided to give it one more week. Margot. I liked her immediately, which surprised me because I'd been bracing myself for complexity, for someone who might be protective of her brother's grief, or suspicious of me, or loyal to the memory of his first mate in ways that would make my presence awkward. Margot was none of those things. She was sharp and direct, and she saw everything. She saw me. She sat across from me at breakfast the morning after she arrived and said, without preamble, "He's being an idiot, isn't he?" Not a question. I looked at her. "He's grieving," I said carefully. "Both can be true," she said. I didn't disagree. She talked to him. I don't know exactly what she said, Margot told me later, in pieces, but in the moment I only knew that she cornered him in the kitchen Saturday morning, and that when I walked past the doorway 30 minutes later, he was standing alone staring at the counter with the expression of a man who has been handed an uncomfortable truth and is choosing to sit with it rather than deflect. That was new. That night, he knocked on my door. I opened it. He was standing in the hallway in plain clothes, no alpha posture, just a man who looked like he hadn't slept well and had something to say. "Can I come in?" I let him in. He sat in the chair by the window. I sat on the edge of the bed. There was space between us, the careful distance we'd been maintaining for 6 months, and I noticed, with the part of me that pays attention to small things, that this time it seemed to bother him. "I owe you an apology," he said. I waited. He told me about her then. Really told me. Her name, Lyra, and how she died and where he had been standing when it happened. He didn't dress it up. He didn't deliver it as an explanation designed to excuse him. He delivered it as a truth he'd been keeping too close to his chest, and the act of saying it out loud cost him something. I watched his throat work. "I've been using grief as a reason not to try," he said. "And that's not fair to you." Here is where I could tell you I immediately softened. I could tell you my heart opened like a window and everything was suddenly warm. But that would be a lie, and you deserve the honest version. What I felt was cautious hope. The kind that's been burned before and knows to move carefully. So I told him the truth. I've been thinking about leaving. I watched something shift in his face. Something that looked almost like fear. "Not because I don't feel the bond," I said quickly. "I do. It's loud, actually. Constant." I paused. "But a bond isn't enough if the person on the other end is somewhere else. I can't build a life with someone's back." "I know," he said. "Can you actually change?" I asked. I made myself hold his eyes. "Or are you going to try for 2 weeks and then drift back to where it's safe?" He didn't give me a polished answer. He said, "I don't know. I know I want to. I know that every piece of you I've actually let myself see has been remarkable. And I've been keeping my eyes closed. Remarkable. He said it simply, without performing it. And somehow that landed harder than any grand declaration would have. Start with something small, I told him. Tell me something true. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told me about the bed. About sleeping on the left side for 5 years because she'd always wanted the right. About not being able to cross the invisible line because crossing it would mean admitting she was really gone. She's really gone, I said softly. Not as a knife. Not as a correction. As a gift, if he'd take it. He said, yeah. And his voice cracked on it, and I sat across from him while he held something he'd been refusing to hold for years. I didn't reach for him. I didn't rush to fix it. Because I have learned the hard way that grief doesn't need to be fixed. It needs to be witnessed. I witnessed him. And that, I think, was the beginning of something real. Part 5, Learning to Trust Him. The version of him I'd been waiting to meet. Things didn't change overnight. I want to be clear about that because I don't want to give you a false picture of what healing looks like. There was no single moment where everything realigned and the tension dissolved and we became easy. We became more honest. Incrementally. Step by step. He started paying attention in a way that was different from before. Not the performative attention, the polite questions, the courteous gestures he'd been offering like they were a quota to fill. Actual attention. The kind where you can feel someone actually seeing you. He noticed I took my coffee with too much sugar and a splash of oat milk, and one morning it was just there, exactly right, no announcement. I stood in the kitchen holding the cup and had a small, private moment where I felt something loosen in my chest. He started coming on the evening walks, something I'd been doing alone since my second week, tracing the same forest path because the trees didn't require anything from me and I found that restful. He started walking with me. We didn't always talk. Sometimes we just moved through the same space, and it turned out that was enough, or at least it was a beginning. He asked me about my life. My actual life. My past, my choices, the years I'd spent building something in the human world. He asked about the Valdres pack. I told him what I hadn't told almost anyone, what it had felt like to be 14 and watch something I loved come apart. The way belonging, for me, had become something I held lightly ever since. The way I'd moved through Ironveil for 6 months like a guest because I had practiced not claiming, not attaching, not assuming anything was mine to keep. He listened. He didn't try to fix it or reframe it or offer a solution. He just listened. When I finished, he said, very quietly, I'd been making that worse. The not claiming. I made you feel like you couldn't. Yes, I said. I'm sorry. He said it without hedging. Without immediately following it with an explanation or a defense. Just the apology, clean and whole. I told him about Lyra in return. He'd told me her name and the shape of her death, but now I asked about her life, what she'd been like, what she'd meant to him. I asked not because I wanted to compare myself or measure the gap, but because she was real and she had mattered and pretending otherwise felt like asking him to lie. He talked about her the way you talk about someone when the grief has started, finally, to soften into something that doesn't cut as deep. With love. With humor, even, he told me she used to steal food off his plate and argue with the elders until they turned red, and when he laughed remembering it, the laugh was sad and fond in equal measure. She sounds like she would have been a force, I said. She was. I'm glad you had her. He looked at me then. Really looked at me. And he said, I'm glad I have you. No caveat. No qualification. No but. I didn't make a big deal of it. I kept walking. But I moved half a step closer. The evenings became ours, the forest path, the quiet, the conversations that got easier and longer and more honest. I let myself leave books on the shared shelves in the study instead of keeping everything contained to my room. Small acts of claiming. He noticed. He didn't remark on it, just made space. Roan and I had developed a genuine friendship by then. He was dry and blunt and quietly kind, and he had clearly been worried about Caden in ways he'd never say directly. He told me once, sideways, the way he told most things, he's better with you around. Even when he was bad at showing it. I took that and held it. Britta threw me a small birthday dinner in the 7th month that I hadn't told anyone was coming, which meant either pack records or Roan, and I chose not to investigate. Caden gave me a book I'd mentioned in passing 3 weeks earlier. Just mentioned, not as a request, just as part of a sentence. He'd remembered and he'd found it and he handed it to me without ceremony. I looked at the book and I looked at him and I thought, oh. He's been paying attention. He's been paying attention for a while. Part 6, the night I finally came home. What it means to be truly seen. 8 months after I came to Ironveil, I stopped feeling like a guest. It happened quietly, the way most real things do. Not a grand ceremony. Not a formal declaration. Just a gradual accumulation of small moments until one morning I woke up and looked around the East Wing guest suite and thought, I'd been living here for 8 months and I still feel like I should ask permission to rearrange the furniture. That wasn't his fault anymore. Not by that point. He'd changed. I'd seen it, in the walks, in the conversations, in the way he now looked at me across dinner like I was actually in the room with him. The distance that remained was mine now. That was a strange thing to realize. That I had spent months being hurt by his walls, and now that he'd started taking them down, I was standing on my side of a distance I had built myself. Old habit. Old protection. Don't claim. Don't attach. Don't assume. I was still practicing a lesson I no longer needed. It was nearly 3 in the morning when he knocked. I'd been awake, I'm a light sleeper, always have been, and I opened the door to find him standing there looking like he'd just understood something important. I've been an idiot, he said. It's 3 in the morning, Caden. I know. He stopped. Started over. Will you please stop sleeping in the guest suite? I looked at him. You're my mate, he said. You should have been in the main room from the beginning. That's your room. I'm sorry it took me this long to say that. I held his gaze for a long moment. You're not going to keep disappearing on me? I said. No. You're going to actually be there. Present. Yes. Because I don't need perfect. I've never needed perfect. I need present. I know that, he said. And I'm going to spend whatever time it takes proving I mean it. I stood in the doorway of the guest room I'd been living in for 8 months. And I looked at this man, this complicated, grieving, gradually opening man who the moon goddess had decided was mine, and I made a choice. Not because the bond told me to. Because I wanted to. Help me move the books, I said. There are a lot of them. We moved my things at 3 in the morning. It took almost an hour and we barely talked, and it was the least romantic move imaginable. Boxes of books and a collection of plants I'd accumulated and the particular organizational chaos of a person who has been living out of temporary for months, and somewhere in the middle of it, he laughed. Really laughed. At something I said about the sheer number of tote bags I'd somehow acquired. Surprised, unguarded, genuine. I had not heard him laugh like that before. I wanted to hear it again. When it was done, I stood in the middle of a room that was suddenly, actually mine, and I looked around at the space I'd been afraid to claim for most of a year. His space. Our space. The space where maybe, slowly, we would learn to be something real. Better, I said. Yeah, he said. It is. He looked at me the way he'd been slowly learning to look at me, not through me, not past me, not with the middle distance of a man living in a memory. At me. Just me. I'm sorry it took me so long to see you, he said. And I thought about 14-year-old Sarah, standing on a doorstep with a bag packed, refusing to be absorbed into someone else's grief. I thought about 17 years of building something all by herself that was hers and solid and true. I thought about the autumn council and hands that shook and a bond that arrived without an invitation. I thought about 8 months of being invisible and the midnight garden and the book he remembered and the coffee he got exactly right and the laugh I wanted to hear again. "I'm still here," I said. He exhaled like he'd been holding something for a very long time. "I know," he said. "I'm not going to take that for granted again."